Here is a question that trips up almost everyone who thinks they know Africa's economy. Which is Africa's richest country? If you said Nigeria, you are behind on the news. If you said South Africa, you might be right depending on which data you use. If you said Seychelles, most people would laugh. But Seychelles has the highest income per person of any country on the entire African continent. Here is the thing about wealth. It depends entirely on how you measure it. A country with 200 million people and a $400 billion economy looks very different from a country with 100,000 people and a $2 billion economy, until you divide that economy by the number of people in it. And when you do that division, the entire map of African wealth reshuffles completely. Today I am going to give you the complete picture, Africa's richest countries in 2026 by total GDP, by GDP per capita, by fastest growth, and by the honest story behind the numbers that most rankings never tell you. Including the extraordinary story of Nigeria's fall from Africa's largest economy to fourth place, and exactly why it happened. Let us get into it. Welcome to the channel. This video uses IMF World Economic Outlook projections from April 2026 as its primary data source, the most authoritative and most current economic data available for African countries at this point in the year. Where figures vary between sources, I will explain why and give you the range. Nominal GDP figures are in current US dollars. Where I discuss GDP per capita, I will specify whether I am using nominal or purchasing power parity figures, because these produce meaningfully different results and the difference matters for understanding what wealth actually means for the people living in these countries. Before I give you a single number, I want to establish the most important concept in this entire video, because failing to understand it is why most conversations about Africa's richest countries generate more confusion than clarity. There are two fundamentally different ways to measure a country's economic wealth. Measure 1. Total GDP, gross domestic product. This is the total market value of all goods and services produced within a country in a given year. It tells you the total size of the economy. A large country with a large population producing a lot of economic activity will have a high total GDP. This is why Nigeria, Egypt, South Africa, and Algeria, all large countries with large populations, dominate Africa's total GDP rankings. Total GDP tells you which countries have the biggest economic engines. Measure 2, GDP per capita. This is total GDP divided by the total population. It tells you the average share of economic output per person, the closest single number we have to a measure of average income or average standard of living. And here is where the ranking completely transforms. Small countries with small populations but significant economic activity, Seychelles with 100,000 people, Mauritius with 1.3 million, Gabon with 2.3 million, suddenly rank at the very top because you are dividing a reasonable economic output by a very small population. GDP per capita tells you which country's wealth reaches the most people most meaningfully. Neither measure is the correct one. They answer different questions. Total GDP tells you about economic power and market size. GDP per capita tells you about average living standards and purchasing power. Throughout this video I am going to cover both, because understanding Africa's economy requires both. A third important distinction, nominal versus PPP. Nominal GDP converts a country's economic output into US dollars at the current exchange rate. This is what most international rankings use. GDP at purchasing power parity, PPP, adjusts for the fact that a dollar buys very different amounts of goods in different countries. Nigeria's nominal GDP looks much lower than its PPP adjusted figure because goods and services in Nigeria are significantly cheaper in real terms than in the US. I will specify which measure I am using throughout. Based on IMF World Economic Outlook April 2026 projections, here are Africa's 10 largest economies by nominal GDP. Number 1. South Africa. GDP approximately $443 to $480 billion. South Africa reclaims the top position as Africa's largest economy in 2026. A position it has alternated with Nigeria and Egypt over the past several years as currency fluctuations have reshuffled the rankings more than any underlying economic change. South Africa's economy is Africa's most diversified and most structurally sophisticated. It has Africa's largest and most developed financial sector. The Johannesburg Stock Exchange is the continent's biggest, most liquid, and most internationally integrated capital market. The banking system is consistently rated among the most stable in the developing world. The mining sector, gold, platinum, coal, diamonds, iron ore, remains a cornerstone of economic output and export earnings. And the services sector, finance, retail, telecommunications, and increasingly technology, has grown to represent the largest share of GDP. The story behind South Africa's 2026 position is one of relative currency stability rather than extraordinary economic transformation. The South African rand, while volatile, has not experienced the catastrophic devaluation that collapsed Nigeria's dollar-denominated GDP. The result is that in US dollar terms, South Africa sits comfortably at the top of Africa's GDP ranking. However, and this is the crucial honest context, South Africa's economy faces severe structural challenges. Unemployment sits above 32% of the working-age population, one of the highest rates in the world. Inequality, as measured by the Gini coefficient, is among the most extreme on Earth. Persistent power outages from the state electricity utility Eskom have constrained economic growth for years. And the political environment, while democratic, faces ongoing pressures that affect investor confidence. South Africa has Africa's largest economy. It does not have Africa's most functional or most equitable economy. 2. Egypt, GDP approximately $399 to $430 billion. The demographic giant. Egypt holds second position with a GDP of approximately $399 to $430 billion depending on the specific projection used. Egypt is a story of extraordinary demographic scale, a population of approximately 110 million people, combined with an economy built around several structural pillars that give it both scale and resilience. The Suez Canal is Egypt's most singular economic asset, one of the world's most critical shipping choke points, through which approximately 12 to 15% of global trade passes annually. Canal revenues generate billions of dollars of direct income for the Egyptian government every year. The scale and strategic importance of this single piece of infrastructure gives Egypt a geopolitical and economic significance that is completely disproportionate to many other indicators of development. Tourism is Egypt's second major pillar. The pyramids, Luxor, Aswan, the Red Sea, drawing tens of millions of visitors annually and generating significant foreign exchange. Agriculture along the Nile Valley has sustained one of the world's oldest continuous civilizations and remains an important sector. And Egypt has made significant investments in infrastructure, industrial parks, renewable energy, and the new administrative capital, a $58 billion planned city under construction outside Cairo that represents one of the most ambitious urban development projects in African history. The honest context, Egypt has faced significant economic pressure in recent years. An IMF program, currency devaluation, high inflation, and significant government debt. The economy has stabilized from its 2022 to 2024 crisis period, but the structural challenges of managing a rapidly growing population against limited resources remain central to Egypt's economic story. 3. Nigeria, GDP approximately $334 to $377 billion. Nigeria's position at third, and in some projections, fourth, in Africa's GDP ranking is the single most remarkable economic story on this list. And it requires honest, detailed explanation because the numbers are genuinely shocking when you understand what happened. In 2022, Nigeria's GDP was reported above $470 billion, comfortably Africa's largest economy, by a significant margin. By 2026, that same economy converts to approximately $334 to $377 billion in US dollar terms. Nigeria has not shrunk in real terms. In naira, the economy has actually grown. But in dollar terms, which is what international GDP rankings measure, the economy has contracted dramatically. And the reason is almost entirely the exchange rate. When President Bola Tinubu assumed office in May 2023, his administration implemented two significant and necessary but economically painful reforms: the removal of petrol subsidies that had cost the government approximately $10 billion per year and the liberalization of the foreign exchange market, which had been operating a de facto dual exchange rate system. The naira, which had been officially held at approximately 460 naira to the dollar through the managed rate, was allowed to find its market level. It fell sharply, from approximately 460 to the dollar to over 1,500 to the dollar by mid-2024 and has remained in a significantly weaker range since. The practical effect on Nigeria's GDP in dollar terms is straightforward. When you convert the same naira value of economic output at 1,500 naira per dollar instead of 460 naira per dollar, you get approximately one-third of the dollar figure. This is why Nigeria's dollar GDP appears to have collapsed even as its naira GDP has grown. The underlying economy, the factories, the farms, the services, the people working and producing, has not disappeared. It simply converts to far fewer dollars at the new exchange rate. Nigeria remains Africa's most populous nation with over 220 million people, Africa's largest oil producer, Africa's largest telecommunications market, and Africa's most dynamic entrepreneurial and technology ecosystem. The economic trajectory under the current reform program is cautiously positive. The IMF projects 4.1% growth in 2026. But the exchange rate story means Nigeria's nominal GDP ranking will remain significantly lower than its pre-2023 peak until either the naira recovers meaningfully or the underlying economy grows enough to close the gap. 4. Algeria, GDP approximately $285 to $317 billion. The oil state that most investors overlook. Algeria sits at fourth in Africa's GDP ranking, a position that surprises many people who do not follow African economics closely because Algeria has a low international profile relative to its economic size. Algeria's economy is overwhelmingly driven by hydrocarbons. Oil and gas revenues account for the vast majority of export earnings and government revenues. Algeria has the 10th largest proven natural gas reserves in the world and significant oil reserves. The country's state oil company, Sonatrach, is the largest company in Africa by revenue. The honest assessment of Algeria's economic model is that it is both wealthy in the short term and exposed in the long term. The high hydrocarbon revenues fund generous government subsidies, energy, food, and housing are heavily subsidized, that keep social stability but create economic distortions and limit diversification. The private sector outside hydrocarbons is underdeveloped. And as global energy transition accelerates, Algeria's long-term reliance on fossil fuel revenues faces genuine structural risk. Algeria's stock market is one of the least developed on the continent and the economy is heavily state-directed. These features make Algeria largely invisible to international investors despite its GDP size, which is why the country sits at fourth in Africa's economic ranking but receives far less attention than countries like Kenya, Ethiopia, or Morocco that are significantly smaller but more economically dynamic and open. 5. Morocco, GDP approximately $194 billion. Africa's most diversified non-oil success story. Morocco at fifth represents something genuinely different from the oil-dependent economies above it, a diversified, industrializing, internationally integrated economy that has grown its GDP through deliberate structural transformation rather than resource extraction. Morocco has built significant industrial capacity in automotive manufacturing. It is now Africa's largest car manufacturer, producing vehicles for Renault, Stellantis, and other European brands for both domestic use and export. Aerospace manufacturing has grown rapidly. Phosphate mining and processing. Morocco controls approximately 70% of the world's phosphate reserves, generates substantial export earnings. Tourism is a major contributor. And Morocco's agricultural sector, while weather-dependent, is sophisticated and export-oriented. The country has also made enormous investments in renewable energy, particularly solar. The Noor Ouarzazate solar complex is one of the world's largest concentrated solar power plants. Morocco's ambition to become a renewable energy exporter to Europe through undersea cables is backed by concrete investment and credible infrastructure. Morocco is hosting the 2030 FIFA World Cup jointly with Spain and Portugal, an event that is driving additional infrastructure investment, tourism development, and international visibility. The World Cup preparation is contributing to an economic growth period that is expected to continue through the end of this decade. The honest context: Morocco's economy, while genuinely impressive in its diversification, still faces significant challenges: a large rural-urban income gap, youth unemployment, water scarcity as a growing constraint, and a geographic concentration of economic activity in Casablanca and Rabat that leaves many regions significantly behind. 6. Kenya. GDP approximately $130 to $145 billion. East Africa's technology and logistics hub. Kenya holds 6th position and represents a different kind of African economic story, a country without significant oil or mineral wealth that has built a dynamic, services-led economy through technology adoption, financial innovation, and regional connectivity. M-Pesa, Kenya's mobile money platform launched in 2007, is one of the most referenced examples of African technological innovation in the global economics literature. It enabled financial inclusion at a scale and speed that traditional banking infrastructure could not have achieved, and it spawned an entire ecosystem of fintech, logistics, and digital commerce that continues to drive economic activity. Kenya's technology sector, including companies like Safaricom, M-Kopa, and a growing startup ecosystem in Nairobi's Silicon Savannah, is the most developed in East Africa. Kenya is also East Africa's logistics hub, Mombasa's port, the standard gauge railway connecting the coast to Nairobi and beyond, and Nairobi's position as the regional headquarters for dozens of multinational companies and international organizations including multiple UN agencies. The tourism sector, anchored by the Masai Mara, Amboseli, and the Kenyan coast, generates significant foreign exchange. The honest context: Kenya faces significant government debt pressures in 2026, a legacy of infrastructure investment borrowing that has stretched fiscal space. Inflation has been a challenge in recent years, and political tensions following elections have periodically created uncertainty. But Kenya's economic trajectory and its technology ecosystem position it as one of Africa's most important economies for the next decade regardless of its current nominal GDP ranking. 7. Ethiopia. GDP approximately $120 to $130 billion. Africa's fastest growing large economy. Ethiopia at 7th is the continent's most compelling growth story, a country that has been growing at 6 to 8% annually for over a decade and shows no sign of slowing in 2026, where IMF projections put growth at approximately 7.1%, one of the fastest rates on the continent and globally. Ethiopia's growth has been driven by government-led industrialization, industrial parks, export-oriented manufacturing, large-scale infrastructure investment including a massive hydroelectric dam program. The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam on the Blue Nile, Africa's largest hydroelectric dam, is now generating significant electricity output that is both meeting domestic demand and beginning to support regional export ambitions. Agriculture remains the foundation of Ethiopia's economy. The country is Africa's largest coffee producer and the world's 5th largest. But manufacturing, particularly textiles, leather goods, and cut flowers, is growing rapidly as Ethiopia positions itself as a low-cost manufacturing destination for international companies looking for alternatives to Southeast Asian production bases. The honest context: Ethiopia faces significant political and security challenges. The Tigray conflict that began in 2020 and continued through 2022 caused enormous human and economic damage. Regional conflicts in Amhara and Oromia have continued to pose security and economic challenges. The country carries significant government debt from infrastructure investment. And the economic data, while showing strong growth, reflects a population of approximately 130 million people, meaning GDP per capita remains very low despite impressive headline growth. 8. Ghana. GDP approximately $78 to $85 billion. The recovery story of 2026. Ghana sits at 8th, and 2026 represents a recovery year for an economy that went through one of its most difficult periods in 2022 and 2023 when the country defaulted on its external debt and required an IMF bailout program. Ghana has historically been considered one of West Africa's most politically stable and economically well-managed countries, the gateway to West Africa with strong democratic institutions, a relatively transparent business environment, and natural resources including oil and cocoa. The economic crisis of 2022 to 2023 was a genuine shock to that reputation, driven by a combination of the global commodity price disruption following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, pandemic-era debt accumulation, currency weakness, and fiscal mismanagement. The IMF program has stabilized the economy. Inflation has come down from its peak. The cedi has found some stability. And the government's debt restructuring program has created a path back toward fiscal sustainability. Ghana's growth rate in 2026 is projected to recover to approximately 4 to 5%, modest but positive after the crisis years. The honest context: the debt restructuring required significant pain for domestic bondholders and for pension funds that held Ghanaian government securities. The recovery is real but incomplete, and the path back to Ghana's pre-crisis economic standing will take several more years. 9. Côte d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast, GDP approximately $111 billion. West Africa's fastest growing economy. Côte d'Ivoire at 9th is one of Africa's most consistent and impressive economic growth stories, a country that has sustained growth rates of 6 to 8% annually for over a decade, making it one of the fastest-growing economies on the continent. Côte d'Ivoire is the world's largest producer of cocoa, controlling approximately 45% of global cocoa production, and the sector drives significant export earnings, employment, and rural economic activity. The country is also a major producer of cashews, rubber, and palm oil. Abidjan is the economic capital of Francophone West Africa, the regional headquarters for banks, trading companies, and international organizations across the French-speaking African region. The country has invested heavily in infrastructure, ports, roads, energy, that support its role as the dominant regional economic hub for West Africa's Francophone nations. And the political stability that has characterized Côte d'Ivoire since the end of its civil war period has created conditions for sustained private investment and growth. 10. Angola, GDP approximately $90 to $95 billion. The oil giant at a crossroads. Angola at 10th has one of Africa's most resource-concentrated economies, heavily dependent on oil, which accounts for the vast majority of export revenues and government income. The country is sub-Saharan Africa's second-largest oil producer after Nigeria. Angola's economic trajectory in 2026 is shaped by the dual forces of declining oil production from aging fields and the government's effort to diversify away from oil dependency, with investments in agriculture, infrastructure, and special economic zones. The reform program introduced by President João Lourenço since 2017 has created a more stable macroeconomic environment and attracted some additional foreign investment. But the structural dependence on hydrocarbons and the legacy of debt from oil-backed loans, particularly from China, remain central challenges. Now here is where everything gets genuinely fascinating. Let me show you what happens when you divide Africa's GDP figures by population. Number 1. Seychelles. GDP per capita approximately $17,095. Seychelles, 115 islands, approximately 100,000 people, has the highest GDP per capita on the entire African continent. This is not a surprise when you understand the structure. A tiny population, a sophisticated and high-value tourism industry drawing wealthy international visitors, and a financial services sector used by international companies as a routing point for African investment. When you divide even a modest total economy by 100,000 people, the per capita figure looks extraordinary. Seychelles consistently ranks above South Africa, Egypt, and Nigeria on per capita measures, despite being invisible on total GDP rankings. Number 2, Mauritius, GDP per capita approximately $11,072. Mauritius at second represents a similar model to Seychelles, a small island nation with a population of approximately 1.3 million that has built a sophisticated, high-value economy through tourism, financial services, and information technology. The World Bank has classified Mauritius as a high-income economy, one of only 2 African countries to achieve this classification alongside Seychelles. Mauritius has deliberately positioned itself as Africa's most business-friendly jurisdiction, strong rule of law, low corruption, transparent financial regulation, and has attracted significant foreign investment as a result. Number 3, Libya, GDP per capita approximately $8,071. Libya's per capita figure reflects its oil wealth distributed across a relatively small population of approximately 7 million people. However, Libya's per capita income figure requires the most significant contextual asterisk of any country on this list. Libya is in a state of ongoing political fragmentation, 2 rival governments, a divided central bank, competing militias, that means the official GDP figure and the per capita income figure bear almost no relationship to the actual lived experience of most Libyans. Oil revenues flow through a system so fragmented and corrupted by competing factions that the statistical wealth measured by GDP per capita is largely fictional for most of the population. Libya is a cautionary example of why GDP per capita and actual welfare are not the same thing. Number 4, Gabon. GDP per capita approximately $7,826. Gabon is one of Africa's most interesting economic paradoxes, a country with significant oil wealth and a small population that produces a high per capita income figure while also having significant poverty, infrastructure gaps, and in 2023 experienced a military coup that removed the long-serving Bongo family dynasty. Gabon's per capita wealth has not translated into broadly shared prosperity. Income inequality is high and oil revenues have historically been concentrated rather than distributed. The post-coup government's economic management is still finding its direction in 2026. Number 5, South Africa. GDP per capita approximately $6,558. South Africa, Africa's largest economy by total GDP, drops to 5th by per capita, reflecting the reality of dividing a large economy across a population of approximately 62 million people. South Africa's per capita income figure is the highest among Africa's large population nations, but it masks one of the world's most extreme income distributions. The average South African income figure is pulled significantly upward by a small wealthy population. The median income, the income of the person in the exact middle of the income distribution, is dramatically lower than the per capita average. Number 4, Gabon. GDP per capita approximately $7,826. Gabon is one of Africa's most interesting economic paradoxes, a country with significant oil wealth and a small population that produces a high per capita income figure while also having significant poverty, infrastructure gaps, and in 2023 experienced a military coup that removed the long-serving Bongo family dynasty. Gabon's per capita wealth has not translated into broadly shared prosperity. Income inequality is high and oil revenues have historically been concentrated rather than distributed. The post-coup government's economic management is still finding its direction in 2026. Number 5, South Africa. GDP per capita approximately $6,558. South Africa, Africa's largest economy by total GDP, drops to 5th by per capita, reflecting the reality of dividing a large economy across a population of approximately 62 million people. South Africa's per capita income figure is the highest among Africa's large population nations, but it masks one of the world's most extreme income distributions. The average South African income figure is pulled significantly upward by a small wealthy population. The median income, the income of the person in the exact middle of the income distribution, is dramatically lower than the per capita average. The total GDP ranking tells you who is richest today. The per capita ranking tells you who is richest per person today. But for anyone thinking about Africa's economic future, where is the money going, where are the opportunities, which countries are building the economic foundations of the next generation, you need to look at the growth rate ranking. And here the story is completely different from both of the rankings above. The fastest growing African economies in 2026 according to IMF projections are concentrated in East and West Africa, and most of them are not in the top 10 by total GDP. Rwanda is growing at approximately 7 to 8%, driven by services, tourism, financial services, and the government's Vision 2050 development plan. Rwanda punches far above its economic weight in terms of governance quality, business environment, and strategic vision. Senegal entered a new economic phase in 2024 and 2025 when its offshore oil and gas production came online for the first time, and in 2026 the energy sector is adding significantly to an already growing economy driven by infrastructure, agriculture, and services. Senegal's growth rate is among the highest on the continent. Ethiopia at 7.1% growth, as covered in the main ranking, is the fastest growing large African economy and represents one of the most ambitious development programs on the continent. Côte d'Ivoire at 6 to 7% growth is the standout performer in West Africa, consistent, driven by genuine economic diversification, and reinforced by political stability. Tanzania at approximately 5 to 6% growth is East Africa's quiet achiever, a large economy growing steadily through agriculture, mining, tourism, and infrastructure, with significant natural gas reserves that have not yet been fully monetized. The pattern that emerges from the growth data is clear and significant. The fastest growing African economies are not the oil giants. Nigeria, Algeria, and Angola, despite their GDP size, are growing more slowly than economies a fraction of their size. The sustainable growth is being generated by diversification, infrastructure, technology adoption, and governance improvement. This is exactly what the African Development Bank's 2026 Regional Outlook emphasizes. The continent's most resilient economies are those building broad-based productive capacity rather than extracting and exporting finite natural resources. Let me close with the most important lessons from this data, because numbers without context produce misconceptions rather than understanding. Lesson 1. Currency is the most dangerous variable in African GDP rankings. Nigeria's dramatic fall from Africa's largest economy illustrates this perfectly. The underlying Nigerian economy, in naira terms, has grown. But in dollar terms it has shrunk, almost entirely because of the naira's devaluation. Any comparison of African GDP figures across time or between countries must account for the exchange rate variable. This is why the IMF and serious economists often prefer PPP-adjusted figures for cross-country comparisons. They strip out the exchange rate distortion and measure actual economic output more comparably. Lesson 2. Size and speed are completely different bets. The largest economies are not the fastest growing. Nigeria and Algeria have far more nominal GDP than Rwanda and Côte d'Ivoire. But Rwanda and Côte d'Ivoire are growing significantly faster and building more diversified, resilient economic foundations. For investors and for young professionals thinking about where to build careers, the growth trajectory matters as much as the current size. Lesson 3. GDP per capita and actual welfare are not the same thing. Libya's high per capita income with a fragmented, conflict-affected economy. South Africa's high average income with extreme inequality and 32% unemployment. Gabon's oil wealth that has not reached most of its population. These examples illustrate consistently that GDP per capita is a useful but seriously incomplete measure of how well a country's economic output actually serves its people. Human development indicators, education, healthcare, life expectancy, social mobility, tell a different and often more honest story. Lesson 4. Africa's economic story is genuinely diverse. The continent of 55 countries and 1.4 billion people does not have a single economic narrative. It has oil exporters and technology hubs. It has small wealthy islands and vast agricultural economies. It has crisis-hit economies recovering through IMF programs and fast-growing economies barely on the international radar. The richest countries in Africa in 2026 are a starting point for understanding this diversity, not a summary of it. And that is the complete picture: Africa's richest countries in 2026 by total GDP, by GDP per capita, by growth rate, and by the honest context that numbers alone cannot provide. South Africa at the top by total GDP. Seychelles at the top by per capita income. Ethiopia, Senegal, Rwanda, and Côte d'Ivoire at the top by growth rate. And Nigeria, still Africa's most populous, most entrepreneurial, most dynamic nation, rebuilding from a currency-driven GDP decline that obscures an economy with extraordinary long-term potential. Africa's combined GDP is projected to exceed $3.56 trillion in 2026, and the African Development Bank projects the continent to remain the world's second fastest growing region. The numbers are not just statistics. They are the story of 1.4 billion people building economies, navigating challenges, and creating the future. That is a story worth understanding. If this video gave you a clearer picture of Africa's economic landscape, give it a thumbs up and share it. Subscribe for more data-driven content on global economics, travel, and mobility. And drop a comment telling me which country's story surprised you most. I read every single one. See you in the next video.